All right. Nope, love that one. Turn that off. All right, we'll give everyone a couple minutes just to get populated. How'd you guys like the 5-hour history of design lecture? Sorry about that. Future iterations of the class will have that broken up. So you guys just got the worst end of it.
But it was good though.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad.
A lot of information, and it's sort of nice to see that you condense everything into like.
I like to say it's a little like drinking out of a fire hose. You just have to learn how to regulate the pressure.
I'd also suggest, since the lecture followed a hierarchy of history of design, I would also suggest if you had like chapters.
That's what we're going to do. Yep. So in the future, you guys are getting a little bit of an underdeveloped version. Like I said, we're going to build the point. Come on in. Ah, gotcha. So you guys got a slightly underdeveloped version only because we're building it kind of quickly. So that said, I'm uploading it to YouTube. Future classes are going to get like an actual player that asks questions during the. It's going to be great. You guys just get the easier version. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll give everyone just like another couple of seconds, but I do want to start by saying you guys really sort of blew my socks off a little bit with the poster assignment. It gives me a good gauge for what it is that we're working with in the class, and I think maybe some of you guys surprised each other. So that's really nice. I appreciate you guys putting lots of effort into that. It's going to be a good class. That's usually a good gauge for me in the beginning, is to understand what skills you all already have. That way I can speak to those a little bit better. I sort of learned somewhat quickly that this class is a little bit larger than I anticipated, and that's okay. I like it that way. Some of you guys may have gotten feedback in Slack, some of you guys maybe didn't, and I want you to know that that's not because I don't like your work. It's just because I am one person, Professor Storm is one person, and I don't know that we'll be able to give feedback all of the time, but we will certainly do our best to, at the very least, give feedback on projects, okay? Labs might get a little bit difficult just because of the number of students that we have in the class, okay? But if for whatever reason you get an incomplete, what I do promise is that you will get feedback if you got an incomplete on something. Any questions on that before we get started? Cool. By and large, everyone did really well, so I'm not concerned at all. All right, I do want to get us going because we do have a lot to cover in design elements here. Who's heard of design elements before? Okay, several of you. For some of you, this might be a refresher. For others, by the way, really quick online, you can hear me if I'm like doing this, right? Could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Where
cool.
you were was just fine.
All right, good. I will also do my best to project. So for some of you guys, this might be a little bit of a refresher. For others of you, this might be the first time you're hearing this information. That's fine. That is what this class is designed to be, right? It's designed to get everyone, no matter your background, up to the same level. That way, as you guys are going into your grad studies, you will be ready and prepared to use the tools, take on the tasks, understand design a little bit, and sort of proceed from there, okay? Coming in. All right, so getting started with line. Line is probably one of the easiest and simplest things to understand. This is sort of your opportunity to make your high school geometry teacher proud. Can anyone tell me what a line is?
A line is a simple line.
Sure. What is the geometry definition of a line?
Oh, segment is
Meeting of two dots, yes. So a line, literally two dots connected, right? It doesn't matter if it's a straight line, it could be curved line as well, right? Yes.
Lecture 1.2 is actually not available.
That's because we're recording it right now. So what's happening is that camera is watching me. All the online students are going to watch this later, so I'll unlock that then. If you're registered as an in-person student though, the lectures don't unlock until later on at the end of the semester. So it gives you all a little incentive to be here in class with me. Cool. Gives me someone to talk to. So that was a simple question. It's only going to get harder from here. Hang on a sec. There we go. So a line is the way that 2 points in space are connected. Okay, very, very easy. Pretty simple, hopefully nothing new. Now, how can we use lines to aid our work? Okay? Lines can help us direct the eye toward a certain point in your composition. Doing a little bit of reading off the slides, I apologize, but taking a look at these two examples from the Bauhaus, where does your eye go? Anyone? I heard. Okay. Where does your eye start here? Right here? And then it kind of shoots up the line towards the end of all the convergence of the lines, right? So this is an example of what we would call leading lines. How about this one? Bottom of the top. Okay, your eye, I'm sure, is sort of starting down in this like red square area and then sort of tracking up to the top. Yeah? Okay. So there are a number of principles. We'll get into those in a minute, but there's a number of principles also aiding this design. So note that the lines aren't doing all of the work here, but it is certainly helping. Right? It is sort of scientifically taking the user's eye somewhere that you want it to go. Now, these are called thick line posters. They were designed by Aaron Draplin. This is sort of a great example of how lines can actually be the entire subject, right? There's nothing here other than lines. It can be the entire composition rather than just an element of the composition, right? So who here's a little bit familiar with Illustrator? A couple of you guys? So if you think about it, this is a line, and then you've just increased the stroke. Really, really thick, right? So lines can also sort of serve as shapes when you start getting that thick, but by and large, it's still a line, right? Line can also be really heavily used in things like henna, which is sort of a temporary form of skin decoration, right? Many of you guys are probably familiar with henna. It's part of many of your cultures. And it can also be used as a very spiritual or ritualistic circumstance during things like Hindu and Muslim weddings. Lots of South Asians use things like henna in order to demarcate special occasions and things like that. Cornrows actually are also a great use of line, right? You're using strong forms of line in the hair, and that can even be used as a form of symbolic identification, right? So, cool. We talked about line for a minute here. Let's move on to the next one, which is shape. Getting a little bit harder. Can anyone tell me what types of shapes there are? I'm hearing some muddling. Go ahead and speak up.
Infinite number of shapes.
There's an infinite number of shapes. Let's get a little more specific. Anyone? All right, I'm already stumping you, huh? All right, so I can give you a hint. There's three of them. There are three different types of shape. There are any shape that you design will either be organic, geometric, or abstract. Okay, that's a good way to sort of classify what one very astute student said, an infinite number of shapes, right? In design, I think we're always trying to figure out ways to classify things so that we can make our lives of infinitesimal distance very small, right? So for example, Moser's cover of Versanctum shows how very organic shapes, much of you guys might be familiar with this from Art Nouveau. Who chose Art Nouveau to do their poster? No one in here? Maybe some online folks. But this would be a great example of Art Nouveau, using very organic shapes, right? To create imagery, but also to, you'll even see that some of those organic shapes made their way into the typography over here, right? This piece is also, as I already mentioned, a great example of Art Nouveau within art history. It's also an album cover, so it kind of fits into two categories of the history of design lecture there. And then you have more geometric precursor to this, which would be geometric Art Nouveau, but that gets a little bit different. Then you have more geometric shapes, right? This, we learned about this in the History of Design lecture. It's a poster by L. Lazinski. And this is also a really great example that shows how you can communicate an idea through shape alone, right? What this is showing, I mean, anyone here read some pretty archaic Russian? No? Maybe a little over here? No? Okay. No, I think it's safe to say that none of us in here know exactly what this is saying, but we probably all can at least guess what it means, right? The reds are infiltrating the whites, right? There were two sides of this war for the most part, and the reds, being the communists, trying to sort of infiltrate the whites. Yep, touched on all that. So then here we have a poster that was generated for some positive public publicity. Wow, that was a rough one to say. For Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits album. Okay, it's coming out somewhat shortly after a really bad motorcycle accident that Bob Dylan was in. So if you look at a lot of album artwork or posters from the time, it was somewhat heavily using illustration, but there was also generally, for someone as famous as Bob Dylan, probably using photography. And so with Bob Dylan having been in a motorcycle accident, little difficult to get Bob Dylan to sign up for a photo shoot. So we came up, well, I say we, this was actually done by, hang on. Thank you. Yes, it's down the bottom there, isn't it? This one was done by Milton Glaser. He actually illustrated Bob Dylan's silhouette because it's a pretty iconic silhouette, right? And this works as a form of visual communication, also kind of using some of those psychedelic drugs that were implemented to create this poster. Another really great example of slightly organic shape, okay? So we looked at shape. Again, getting a little bit harder. Would anyone like to tell me what they think space is?
Could it be negative things?
That's a little closer to what I'm looking for, but anything else?
A gap between two elements.
Gap between two elements, that's real close too. So space is the area around, above, below, or behind. In 3D, this refers to the area around, above, below, or behind objects. However, in 2D, this gets a little more complicated. It's the area around, above, or below shapes or forms, okay? You can't really be, in theory, behind something in 2D, right? But you can introduce what's called layering, and that gets into design principles. We'll cover that in another lecture. So when a designer talks about space, we often use the language ground, positive space, negative space, and white or blank space to help us identify the various different types of space that we're talking about, okay? The ground is not in reference to the floor or the dirt outside, right? What we're typically talking about is the page or the surface or the area in which the design is going to be placed. And the reason I'm being a little bit vague about that is because a design can really be applied to anything, right? I can put a design on this whiteboard, that would be my ground. In theory, the carpet is a design, so therefore the ground is actually the ground, right? I can put a design on the wall, so therefore the drywall and the paint would be my ground. They can get a picture, yeah? Okay. It's possible for the ground to change. Interesting. So for example, designing a piece of white paper is probably the easiest thing to understand, but what happens if your paper is now black or green or red? Then your design and the principles of color that you'll ultimately end up using will also change along with that. Okay. You may also hear that the ground may be called the frame or artboard. Okay, those of you that are familiar with Adobe, the artboard should sound somewhat familiar. For those of you maybe familiar with Figma, frame might sound a little bit more familiar. However, this same verbiage has made its way into almost any design software. So whatever you're familiar with, there's probably some form of verbiage for ground that may be similar or slightly different. For the most part, Adobe softwares are going to use artboard as their background, unless for whatever reason you're using Adobe Express, in which case I think they chose to use the word frame. Don't worry about that. And then Figma will call theirs a frame. Okay. Positive space. Positive space is the area where objects are placed onto the ground. Okay, so for example, this text is placed onto the ground of my screen, or in this case, the frame, right? And it is positively there. Right? I think that's a good way to phrase that up. If nothing's there, we'll get into that in a minute. So there is positive space. Okay. White space, and frankly, I prefer to use the word blank space, because colonialism, would be any of the areas where objects are not placed. Okay, so there's a great example of blank space. Okay, anywhere where the white text is not. Right? Now, negative space is a little bit of a more difficult one to understand. It's a little bit hard to discern the difference between negative space and blank space. Okay, but I'm hoping this next slide will help with that. Ooh, hang on. There you go. Negative space is the space between the forms. So I think it was you, had mentioned like the space or the distance between things. That's actually negative space. Okay. You can also, in theory, look at like this here also being negative space. I'm trying to oversimplify a little bit just to get the picture through. But you can look at negative space in several different ways. It's mostly like the space between certain items. Okay. This Bauhaus poster sort of announcing an exhibition of Bauhaus work shows how space can actually create forms. Some of you guys were fairly astute in your poster examples that you created showing some early signs of this, where you're kind of using both the negative space as well as the blank space, as well as the positive space to create different things. And that's a really difficult thing to do. But here, when you look at it, you might have to squint a little bit, but you can see a face, right? So that's using very simple positive space to also create different things that you can see within the negative space, right? Because the negative space is where the face actually exists. The positive space is just outline.
And in your comments on Slack, right, is it the blue color that you were referring to?
Yeah, so notice how it's like really desaturated?
Yes.
By the time that the Bauhaus was coming around, printing was not quite as evolved as it got during, let's say, World War II. By World War II, you could get some really more saturated colors. Red and yellow were always easy to hit on press. We'll talk about that a little bit in future lectures, but blue, and even still, certain hues of blue can be really difficult. There was actually a project that I was working on at PetSmart where we used a god-awful purple, and every time that thing came off the press, it looked different. Hated that project. So some colors are still even just a little bit difficult to print, but this is sort of that desaturated. This is probably about as saturated of a blue that the Bauhaus could get. But even still, it was used in very limited scenarios. I'm actually showing you guys quite a few examples with blue in it, so yeah.
Could you explain slightly more the difference between positive and negative space?
Absolutely. So positive space is going to be the items that are literally on the page. So there's your positive space, right? It is literally the individual letters, the individual shapes, Okay? Negative space is the area between those, right? So notice that the text is still black here, but in between it's red. And the reason that there's a distinction there is because when you're reading, for the most part, unless you're perhaps just a little bit unfamiliar with that language, you're actually not reading each individual letter. You're reading the shape of the word as a whole. Or some people can even read the shape of a sentence or a paragraph. Right? So you can use that to implement what's called hierarchy. We'll talk about that in another lecture as well.
So the area in maroon is negative space.
Correct. So in each of these examples, the area is in maroon. So there, that's going to be your white space or your blank space. And then here, that's your positive space, negative space, or I'm sorry, blank space. And then here, the negative space is in between the letters. Cool?
Yeah. But predominantly, we don't really use the negative space. I mean, because in my mind, the only thing that I can think of is like when you have subtitles on like a video, is where you actually have the negative space, which has some sort of color. Whereas most of the time,
this is where you're going to start to learn to think about a designer. And that is, particularly within typography, there's a lot of control that you have within the negative space. Particularly with what's called kerning. We'll talk about that when we get into typography, but also tracking. And so if right now you can read this word relatively quickly because the letters are somewhat close together. But if I keep the N here and put the E way over here and then space all the letters out evenly in between, you don't know it yet, but that's going to subconsciously make you read that word much slower. Why do you think all the car brands take their logo and space it out the width of a damn car? Because they want you to spend some time with it, right? So there is some controls that you have.
So if you were to do that, the space in between the letters, would that be considered negative space then?
Correct. Yep. But I mean, depending on how far you actually space it out, it sort of becomes blank space. But yes, it would still be classified as negative space. Good questions. So we saw that one. The use of space can actually be a significant form of emphasis, right? In this case, the pink triangle is actually a reference to Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people in the 1930s and 40s. Queer people that were interned at death camps had upside down, so inverted from this, they had to wear upside down patches of a pink triangle to symbolize the LGBTQ, that they were part of the LGBTQ community. And this poster, in direct protest to that, flips the triangle upside down as a way to say that we're sort of uprising against, like literal, the direction is uprising against the US government's silence on AIDS by pulling elements from the past and leveraging that as a sort of modern symbol, right? So this is actually, it's almost a fused metaphor, right? Almost. It's a little difficult because if you don't have the context around that triangle, it might not mean as much to you, right? But now you all have the context. Here, David Carson is using space in, around, and between letter forms and passages of copy to sort of create a sense of irreverence and, or maybe disconnection to the content, right? But also, it makes you sort of actively want to decipher the meaning of this. It's not going to be clear until you actually like get in there and start analyzing it. But also, you're never going to figure it out because it's all overlaid on top of each other. But you feel like you're a part of that process of uncovering and deciphering and all that good stuff. But I think a good question to ask here is, what is the meaning when the designer has sort of belligerently or irrationally made it harder to read by inverting the text or overtyping that text, or in some cases overtly obscuring that text, right? And I think that, like a magician, the goal with this design is to disorient, right? It is to distract while simultaneously making you feel like you're paying close attention. And that's what a magician does, right? The magician's telling you, look here, when really the trick is happening over here, right? I think that's what's cool about being a designer is that you can show one thing, but totally do something different or mean something different. But what's cool about this is that each time you look, you can kind of see something a little bit different. All right, moving on to form, okay? Any guesses what form is? No, okay. Form is the way that an object or shape occupies the space. It's a little bit of an abstract description there. So for example, in this poster, the word seduction has a very distinct and almost architectural form, right? But also, as the viewer, we get a sense that the forms and the curling swashes of this typography is actively trying to seduce us, right? The word says seduction, but it's kind of reaching out like it's trying to seduce you, right? I mentioned that design can actually be applied to anything, and in some cases, we may be designing a form that will ultimately be applied to another form, right? So form isn't necessarily how a design looks in 3D, but it is sort of the expectation of what this thing is actually like. I think that's a really nice way to put it into perspective. Here's a great example of still a 2D outcome, but something that uses 3D design to aid. Sometimes the form can actually change the meaning of something. Right? This all goes back to context. Can anyone tell me what those little silver and gold things are? Hershey's Kisses. Keep that in mind for a second. Can anyone actually read what that says?
She's the can't really make out this term.
Would it help if I told you it's a rap lyric? She's the illest bitch alive. Which, in its current expression, doesn't look as offensive as it actually sounds. And there's a reason for that. Because in its context, it's actually not something all that offensive. It's actually a compliment, right? So when you say it with kisses, it's actually a compliment, right? This is an example from Zach Minich, and it's a really good example. And if you are still having a hard time seeing that it's kisses, there's another angle. So it's actually a really cool way to use form to actually create your design. All right, moving on. Color. I'm gonna stop asking questions about what you think this is at this point. But color is actually different for everyone, believe it or not. Every person's eye sees things a little bit differently. So color is actually a phenomenon that we don't quite fully understand just yet. I think research is getting better and better on it, but it is a phenomenon of light or visual perception. And I think that that word perception is really important there because we can all perceive things a little bit differently. As humans, we can use this phenomenon to really help us differentiate between objects that are otherwise identical, right? We'll get into hierarchy in a little bit, but color is one really cool way that you can introduce a lot of hierarchy really quickly. Color can be used to portray mood, light, depth, point of view, right? Can anyone give me an example of a point of view that uses color?
Sunrise, sunset.
Sunrise, sunset? Not quite.
When you show memory of the past, often use black and white.
Okay. That's actually a really great example. Oh God, what's his name? Christopher Nolan did that in Oppenheimer, right? He used black and white videography to film things that were from one person's perspective, and then he used color photography to film things from another person's perspective, right? So that's really nice. Yeah.
Emphasize like certain things like Schindler's List with the little girl's dress.
Yep, exactly. I think one of the clearest examples, who's at least mildly familiar with American politics? Anyone? Couple people? Okay. So when Donald Trump goes to the speaker and he's wearing what color tie usually? Red. When Biden goes to the speaker, what color tie is he usually wearing? Blue. Why is that? Because they are different points of view. Oftentimes, Democrats are associated with the color blue, Republicans are associated with the color red. Those are two different points of view. And those can aspire some feelings sometimes, depending on the side of the aisle that you're on. Right? So, as designers, it is imperative and essential that we understand color and its psychology and what it means. But that gets hard because the context of a color can change depending on its region, right? And it's important that we understand the language of the region that we're designing for. If you're designing here in the US, color is going to mean one thing, whereas if you're designing with color in China, it's going to mean a totally different thing. I'll get into that in a little bit. Anyone worked with actual clients before? Couple of people? Have you ever had a client say, make it pop? Nothing is worse than having a client say, make the color pop. Sort of leaves you to guess whether that means they want a darker shade of the color or a little bit more saturation. Your guess is as good as mine, right? So having the proper language about color also means that you can help clients better communicate with you, okay? So, color value refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. Value is not the vividness or a color's intensity. Okay? Color value. Hue is largely what defines or makes up each individual color. So for example, red is a hue, orange is a hue, blue is a hue, green, yellow, yeah, you get the picture, purple, right? So hue is the individual segments of each color. Right? A tint is when you take a color and then add white, or in other words, increase the brightness of that color. That's a tint, okay? Adding white, making a color brighter, that's a tint. Another way that you could look at tint is also reducing saturation. That'll get a couple of purists a little frustrated, but you can oftentimes, if you reduce the saturation, as long as you're working on a white ground, that will inherently introduce a tint. That said though, don't lock that in your mind, because if you're working on a black ground and you reduce the saturation, you're going to get a totally different result. You're actually going to end up with, hold on, tone, shade. There we go, sorry. We'll talk about shade in a second. A tone would be if you were adding gray, okay? Or decreasing the brightness of that color. It's really more about adding gray. You're kind of muddling the tone a little bit. And then a shade would be if you added black or decreased the brightness. And once again, this one's going to get some purists mad, but sometimes if you increase the saturation, so long as you're working on a white ground, that will also increase the shade. Saturation's a whole different beast. Okay? We're talking about chroma. I'll give you guys a minute to catch up on that. Any questions so far? Doing my job. All right. Color theory has some problems. There's, again, if you're in one region, color theory is going to be totally different than it will be in another region. But by and large, color theory is the guidelines for mixing, combining, and manipulating colors. Okay. For the most part, color theory has been debunked because of the way that color and the meaning of each color changes based on different cultures. We touched on that a little bit. So for example, red in the West means danger, excitement, urgency, love, whereas in the East, it's more connotated with purity, luck, and happiness. So let's do a little quick experiment. If you think that red means this to you, raise your hand. Okay. If you think red means this to you, raise your hand. No? Okay, interesting. And that's part of it, right? Depending on where you're from, red can mean several different things. So let's try blue. Blue in the West can often, and these are very simplified terms, they can mean a lot more things than this, but blue in the West often means authority, loyalty, safety, trust, right? Whereas in the East, it might be immorality, spirituality, divine joy. I'm sorry, did I say immorality? I meant immortality. Two very different things. Divine joy and heaven. All right, so another quick experiment. Okay, a couple of you. Yeah, all right, so see, we're already seeing how culture can have a little bit of a divide. Purple. This one's interesting. Purple is one of those colors that kind of means a lot of different things, but most of them often align. Who's been to Vegas? A couple of you guys. What color do you see most often in Vegas? Yeah, purple. Why is that? Well, because there's a lot of gambling in Vegas, right? So, I mean, tip number one in the West, you get a lot of wealth when you see the color purple, or at least that's the intonation. Similarly, it also means something equally as prominent for people in the East, which is wisdom. If you're gambling, you're wise. Please don't go spend all your money. So again, we're seeing how sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, right? But where it does actually work, and when I say it, I'm talking about color theory here, where color theory actually works and works well when it comes to color schemes, okay? How do we combine colors that look pleasing, right? Primary colors, which depending on where you grew up, your primary colors might be a little bit different than what you're seeing here, but primary colors being your red, your blues, and your yellows. And then secondary colors being your purples, your oranges, and your greens. And then your tertiary colors, or complementary colors, would be anything that is across the color wheel. Okay? So if you're working with red, the complementary color to red is green. Right? If you have blue, your complement is orange. If you have purple, your complement is yellow. Okay? And you can spin that any way you like on the color wheel, and it will, without a doubt, work. The problem with this is what ends up happening with complementary colors is you very quickly start to look like either Christmas or your favorite sports team. Right? So purple and yellow, Lakers. Right? Blue and orange, I think that's what, the Bears? There's several of them that use the blue and orange. The problem with that is that our eyes actually see color by reflecting light off of a surface, right? So visual color actually looks a little bit more like this. It's not quite as neat as you might think it is on a color wheel like this. You can sort of see a little bit of a shift there, right? And our primary colors are no longer neat and triadic. And our complements are no longer directly across the color wheel. Okay? So in this situation, the blue and the orange, they still work together, but this is what a more complementary color palette would look like. It's kind of incorporating a little bit of purple, purplish blue with a little cyan into the orange. Okay, so we're kind of splitting our complements. That's what this is called, a split complement. Okay. Let's see, I just talked about that. Color models. This one is probably, who's going into print? Anyone? Most of you guys are probably UXers, yeah? UX? Okay, so you really need to know the difference between your color spaces, okay? Can anyone tell me what like the two main color spaces are?
YK.
Yep.
RGB.
There we go. See, everyone else knew the other answer. So yes, there are two primary color spaces. However, we're also going to talk about a few others that are a little bit more relevant to print, but can be used in digital as well. It's just a little less consistent. So starting with RGB. RGB is what is called an additive color process, meaning that it creates color by mixing light. Okay? And I'm going to put big air quotes here, mixes light because it uses light from a light source, like a monitor, screen, to create the color, right? So things like TVs, smartphones, screens, computer screens and displays, things like that, those are all, if it's digital, you can almost always guarantee it's using RGB. If it's print, it gets a little fuzzy. Because of this, the result of combining three primary colors, which we learned are our reds, our greens, and our blues, at least for this application, you create what's called white. Okay, so here, what's happening is all of those lights, every pixel is divided up into usually 3 light sources, and 1 pixel is blue, 1 pixel is green, and 1 pixel is red. Thank you. So in order to get white, all 3 of those are going to be on at the same time. Now multiply that 1,000 times, and you get a nice full piece of white. If you're ever at a sporting event, sit right next to the game board, because those are all RGB displays. And if you look up, the pixels are much bigger, and you can actually see how it's working. It's really cool. So again, here, if you combine blue and green, you get cyan. You combine red and blue, you get magenta. You combine green and red, you get yellow. Here, if you get all 3, you get white. It's not quite that nice and perfect, but for display purposes. It's also somewhat important to note that even though RGB models combine numerical values in order to create a color that can change sort of depending on the device, okay? So as designers, we like to be very specific about color, right? Because, and I'll talk about this in another lecture, but if you are Coca-Cola Red, everyone knows you by that color, right? They don't even need to look on the shelf. They're just going to go and grab the right color red. So if you change that color red even just slightly, people are going to be like, that's not my Coca-Cola. Okay? So we specify color using a 3-digit range. Usually it's up to 255. And 255, 256, something like that. I think it's 255. And you can have all of these. So if all 3 of these say 255, what is that? What color is that going to be? White. If they all say 0, what color is that going to be? White. Great. If R says 255, what color is that? And the rest are 0. Red. If G says 255, what color is that? Great. I think you guys are getting the point. Okay. So that works. However, there's a little bit of a discrepancy. Every single person's screen can be calibrated slightly differently. If we pull up this color red on every single one of your devices right now, it's going to look different on every single device. Unless your phone is bought today and your other friend's phone was bought today, and even then there's still going to be some differences. Okay? So we want to be accurate, but with digital, there's always the chance that someone's using a slightly off-calibrated display. Okay. Let's talk about CMYK for a minute. This is a subtractive color process, meaning that it creates colors by blocking light. I think that one's a little bit easier to understand, right? When you're working on a printer, white is very reflective. So if that doesn't come off the table, white, we all know what color white is, okay? If we're working with a white piece of paper and we're printing ink on it, we're actually blocking the reflectivity of that light, okay? So as you add more color on the page, cyan, magenta, yellow, you end up with actually what's a really ugly brown color. But that's a limitation of print. And then you also, can anyone tell me what the K stands for? No, no. Key, thank you. Yes, it stands for key, which is also, yes, you're black. But does anyone know why it's called key black? No. All right, so when you're working on a printer, oftentimes in very large batches, they have to cut down what are called parent-sized pieces of paper. So they're going to print several of whatever it is that you're printing on a very large sheet of paper. And in order for them to cut it and keep it all in line, as well as keep it in line while it's going off the press, they're going to use what are called registration marks. They look something like that. And so the key is giving the printer, which is scanning these things as it's coming off, something to read so that it can keep everything in line. That way things don't shift. Otherwise you end up with pop art like Andy Warhol, where things are a little out of line, but it still looks that way. Okay? So CMYK blocks light because ink absorbs the light that would typically reflect off the page, resulting in the color that we see. Okay? Because of this, the result of combining the three primary colors in the CMYK color model is black, in theory, right? Like I said, it's a little bit more like a dirty brown. Yep, we talked about that. All right, so can anyone tell me what hex is? Everyone seen what a hex is? Okay, what does it look like?
Numbers. And alpha
Yeah,
numeric.
exactly. It stands for hexadecimal. Okay. Anyone take Latin? Hex, 6, decimal. There we go. So 6 spaces. Okay. So aptly, it's named because the system uses 6 digits, both numbers and letters. It's A through F, 1 through 6. Okay. And it's sort of what essentially amounts to shorthand for RGB. Okay. So there's what a hex code looks like, right? And really quickly, if we just break this out, does anyone know how this reads?
First 3 are red.
First 3 are red.
Next 2 are green, I think.
Okay. You're close. You're real close. It's in 2. It's even. R, G, B. Okay. So just for quick reference, there's your R, there's your G, there's your B. Okay. I used to be really good at this. Not so much anymore. But you can, if you learn hex codes, you can actually memorize what equals what. And that's going to be on the test. No, it won't. I'm just kidding. All right, so I told you guys we would talk a little bit about Pantone. Who's heard of Pantone? They're pretty popular. They come out with the color of the year every year. Can anyone tell me? Oh wait, I already did that one. We'll get to one at the end. So there's an example of a Pantone. That's what they look like. They're specified colors. 219C. Barbie owns that. Right? I think that they may have actually had that Pantone specified to them. I know for a fact it's trademarked, but I don't know if anyone else can use that color. I might be wrong there. Similarly, anyone Charlie XCX fan? All right, Brad Green, pretty popular. Can anyone tell me what color this is? Who said it? Yep. Coca-Cola Red, right? You stay away from that color unless you want a good lawsuit. It is, don't touch that color. You can get close. You can be one number off, but don't be on 484 if you're working in the food and beverage space. You don't want it. That red is known in every country around the world, with maybe the exception of a few like desolate native tribes, right? disconnected from the world. But even they, I would imagine, have probably had some Coca-Cola trash wash up on their shoulders. Okay, moving on. Any questions on color? That was a lot to sort of unpack. I might bring in a Pantone spec book just to show you guys, but I think we all know what a Pantone is. All right, texture. Texture is the imagined feel of an object or shape. Imagined. It can also be physical, okay? But for the purposes of most of our work that we're going to be doing, most of us are going to be working in 2D design. Anyone in here an HSE major? All of you guys are, for the most part, UX. Okay. So for our purposes, imagined feel of an object or shape, okay? Because we're working in 2D for the most part. Texture can be used to elevate a design or even elevate the experience of something, right? It can be used to elicit a specific response to something or even repel users away so that they don't want to interact with something, right? Has anyone heard about hostile architecture? That's an example. Hostile architecture is like, let's say that you have a bench and oftentimes some homeless people might want to sleep on those benches. I don't particularly agree with it, but oftentimes what cities will do is they'll put like metal straps across that bench just to make it really uncomfortable to use that. That's an example of texture being used as a repellent, right? You can also do the same thing. If you're going into a grocery store and you go to grab a pack of eggs and it's all slimy, what are you going to do with that pack of eggs? You're going to put it back, right? An egg probably broken there. So you can use, that's a bad example, but I think you guys get the point. Braille is probably one of the most common examples of tactile or textural design that actually exhibits itself in the real world, which is quite cool. This poster is one by Suzuki that uses texture, specifically texture from Braille, in both a conceptual way and in a sort of literal way. Okay? So even though I said it's a perceived feel of something, it can actually manifest itself into physical touch. Okay? One of my favorite examples of using texture, and I've gotten to do this a lot in my background, is packaging. Packaging is a really great example of texture. Has anyone, anyone Apple product buyers here? Who keeps their boxes? Yeah, that's all a textural and experiential thing, right? When you buy that Apple product, taking the lid off the top, there's this delay that just makes you like, I want it, right? So that's all texture, okay? In things like packaging and print, you can use what is called embossing, imprint, debossing, sometimes a gold foil or silver foil to sort of elevate or elicit that sort of tactile response that you might want. Sometimes even just as simple as putting a gloss varnish on something can give it a different texture that makes it feel slightly elevated. Okay? Also more expensive to produce. Other more conceptual examples include making typography that feels or looks a little bit tactile. And you can do this with several mediums. This is an assignment that I think almost every undergrad has to do, is like make some form of typography out of unconventional materials. I chose to do mine with hair. I went in for a haircut and I was like, wait, don't touch it. And I sweeped up all the hair. I'll pull it up in class one day, I'm sure. But then I arranged it on a background and photographed it and cut it out and then arranged it into a poster. So here, this one's same concept, but a little bit different, using honey or paper clips, right? So all of these are good examples that use texture. Now, that said, you all have learned the elements of design. Give yourself a round of applause. I do want to go over the assignment with you guys. That way you feel prepared for it and you can ask some questions. Let's see how we're doing on time really quick. Oh, we're good. Any questions before I go into the assignment? Yes,
This is kind of like a social question, not necessarily specifically.
no simple questions, please.
Yeah, no, I said social, like.
Oh, social, got
Don't you feel like,
it. Oops. There we go. Sorry.
with globalization on the internet, that the meaning of color has changed? Like, for example, when we discuss like red in the East and the West, like
Mhm.
historically that's true, especially in the history of design we talked about, right?
Yep.
But do you feel like that's gonna continue to change?
Absolutely, and probably faster.
Yeah.
I don't think, at least in the near future, meaning our lifetimes, that color is ever going to converge into meaning one single thing or even a handful of similarities. I do think that we'll see some convergence on meanings of color, but I think there will always be variations. And not only that, but I think we'll see color starting to mean new things much faster. I think that, bright green, right? I mean, that is now a symbol of like slightly modern anarchy, right? Prior to Charlie XCX coming out with the Brat album, I don't think we would have gotten there other than like maybe some references back to the punk era in the late 2010s. But yes, to answer your question, I think that there will become a more, just like music, right? Music right now, you don't have to be signed under a record label for you to get found and popularized. You just have to make some good freaking music. I think color is going to be the same way, that people are going to start adapting color to new meanings and making it mean what they want it to mean. The problem with that, and this goes into what's called semiotics, which we don't necessarily cover too much in this class, but semiotics is all about communicating new meanings or making something mean something that maybe it didn't before. But that is a collective experience. In order for semiotics to work, everyone kind of has to be in on the joke, right? And so that is a learned thing. That's another topic. Any other questions? All right. So, take a look at lab 1.2. Quick note that I want to put out for everyone. You may have gone in and seen some of the dates changed. Professor Storm and I met this afternoon, and we wanted to find a way to shift some tasks up so that we could give you guys a little bit more time on the passion project at the end. So some stuff might have moved around a little bit. If you planned out your due dates, just make sure to go in and adjust those dates accordingly, okay? That said, this might look like a really in-depth lab on the surface. I promise you, it's going to be easy, and you're going to start, now that you know what the design elements are, I think this will be much easier, okay? So for each element, you need to go out and photograph 3 examples of that element. They have to be different examples, so no just slight composition shift or anything like that. So 3 separate examples of each element. You don't need to be a master photographer to do this. I don't expect anyone to go out there with their 8x10 camera. I mean, knock yourself out if you're talented, but do this with your phones. It doesn't need to be anything laborious or special. I'm not looking for astute compositions. I'm looking for, do you understand what the elements and principles are? Okay, so just out in nature, walk around your neighborhood. There are plenty of examples. You live in an urban environment, you'll be okay. For those of you online, if you're not so urban, that's okay too. Go out and find examples. They're everywhere. Yes, ma'am.
Value.
Value, yeah, good one. So value, you can come up with this in several ways, right? Like, for example, if a building is there, you can photograph that from several different perspectives, right? You can photograph it straight on, which is going to be maybe less value, or you can go to the corner and shoot it straight up so that it looks like it's literally popping out of the frame, right? So you're going to have to get a little bit experimental with some of these. But what I'm looking for is, do you clearly understand how these work? Okay? Any questions?
Did we discuss value today?
We did, very slightly.
Okay.
Value is, let me pull that up in the lecture again. Hang on, where is it? Where's my mouse? There we go. Doink. So value was boink, this guy. Is that look familiar? So notice how there's I guess another way that you could maybe look at value, just to maybe simplify it a little bit, would be depth. Does it look like there's something tactile there? Right? So I think that's an overly simplified version. There are other ways that you can look at value, but I think for someone who's maybe just learning the elements and principles, depth is a good way to look at value. Professor Storm, do you have any adds to that?
I do not.
Okay, well, see, I guess I did a good job.
You did fabulously.
All right, thank you. Any other questions?
We have a question on Zoom. Question is, near where I live, there is a lot of public art wall murals. Are these okay to use as examples, or should they be more, quote, organic?
Good question. I would probably encourage you to approach it slightly more organically. Can it include public art? Yes. Do I think that the public art should be the only subject matter? Probably not. So I think the answer to your question is no. Try to find something that's a little bit more organic in nature. But then again, someone might look at a building as a piece of public art, right? So use your discretion there. Just if you feel like you're stealing someone else's work, probably don't do that. Very welcome. Any other questions? Let me switch back over here. How are we feeling? It's the second day of class. I want to make sure that everyone's feeling confident going into it. Is anyone panicking? A couple of people. Good panic, bad panic? Okay. I really want to stress, like, my expectation of you guys is not to, I mean, you guys knocked my socks off with the posters, but my expectation of you guys is not to feel like you need to be creative geniuses just yet. We'll get there by the end of the class, okay? But I want you guys to feel like you guys can go out into the world, talk about these things eloquently and passionately. That's really where I'm trying to get at here, okay? Awesome. That's all I've got for you guys. Have a wonderful week. Oh, sorry, really quickly, one little update. I will be out of the office. I'll be traveling from Friday until Monday. By the way, there is a holiday on Monday, so if you have classes on Monday, don't come. But if you guys need anything while I'm out, I will be checking Slack somewhat intermittently. But Professor Storm is here as well. She is happy to answer questions for us. So if while I'm out, or even while I'm here, you're welcome to discuss with her as well, okay?
She's on Slack.
She's on Slack as well, yeah. Yep.
Yes, I'm on Slack. I'm here in the classroom, kind of, sort of, but not really. And I know I'm kind of the silent partner, but I'm also an equivalent partner. So don't feel like just because you know Professor Brenneker's face that he's the only one around, because I'm around. I'm not going to be out of town I'd like to be, but I'm not going to be. So you can always reach me. Oh, look, I'm up on the screen again.
There you are. So now they know your face.
So, and when I'm on Zoom, I do always have my video camera on. So I do like to try to be a real person. And occasionally you might get to meet my dog.
Awesome. All right.
His name is Cricket.
Cricket is wonderful, and if Professor Storm is on Zoom, usually Cricket is in her lap. So
Yes.
awesome. All right, guys, have a wonderful day. I'll see most of you guys in the next class. I think that went well, yeah.
Yeah, but another class this week. That's hard math.